I want to talk about Labour's Brexit stance now. Joining us, Dan Hodges, who is a political commentator at the Mail on Sunday, and Owen Jones, who's a columnist at The Guardian. I'll ask you about that in just a second, but I'm sure you're just hearing what our previous contributor was saying about bullying at school. I know that you weren't expecting this, but I'm sure you've got a view anyway. To you, Dan, first of all, I know that you have a little one, don't you? How do you deal with it? I know I had to deal with it with my son at school. Most kids do find themselves in a difficult position, both at school and then also online. I mean, what are your top tips for parents?
Well, I mean, I wouldn't profess to be an expert at all, but I think we just got some very expert advice there. I mean, I personally follow the advice that was given. I mean, I think the key thing is, obviously, as we've just heard, to be aware of what the platforms are that your children are engaging with, understand what those platforms are. Put reasonable limits on the use of those platforms, and as best as you can ensure ways of monitoring the use of those platforms, obviously, but doing so in a way that isn't so heavy-handed, because we all have to accept, whether we like it or not, whether maybe we didn't have these platforms when we were growing up, but they're an integral part of the childhood for all children now. So you have to be aware of it, I think, without being too heavy-handed, without overreacting. Yeah, I know, and my goodness me, do you deal with some online bullying? What's your top tip for dealing with online bullying?
Blimey, that's a really good question. I mean, I think, when we talk about online bullying, it's, I suppose one area that I'm particularly interested in is homophobic bullying, misogynistic bullying. And that's because we live in a profoundly homophobic and sexist society. So, for example, a lot of women commentators who will come on your show, or like yourself, for example, just for doing your job, or people who are women having the temerity to express an opinion, will often get victimised and hounded by pathetic men online who, because of the sexist society in which we live, think they can get away with talking about women however they wish, and being provoked and angered by the very sense of a woman having an opinion. And similarly, homophobic bullying, almost all LGBTQ people have suffered some form, they've heard homophobic abuse either in real life or online. And I think, for example, we've seen protests against LGBTQ inclusive education. It's so important, underlines why it's so important to resist that and to ensure that we have LGBTQ inclusive education from a younger age, which is about teaching people that difference is okay. It's okay, families come in different shapes and sizes. And the same with sexism. I think, it's so important we have education from an earlier age, which confronts kind of quite toxic attitudes towards women. So I think, for me, online abuse is just a manifestation of the kind of problems we've got as a society, which we still haven't dealt with. And I think that's why education is just so critical, really.
Fascinating from both of you guys. Let me talk to you now, if I may, about what you came on to talk about today, which is the fact that we've finally learned from Labour what their policy will be on Brexit, and whether we should have a second referendum or not. Your thoughts on that, Dan?
Well, my main thought is I think you're being staggeringly generous to Labour by saying that we now have clarity on their position. I mean, we know now that they will oppose via referendum, if necessary, any deal that the Conservatives put forward on Brexit, or indeed any no deal that the Conservatives put forward on Brexit. But in terms of Labour's own position and what Labour would do in government, we're not any further forward. I mean, my understanding is Labour's position is still that they believe the referendum result needs to be respected. They would attempt to negotiate their own Brexit, whilst they would put that Brexit to a referendum. Again, I think that's their position, but again, you can obviously never be sure. And presumably would campaign for their own Brexit deal were they to secure one. But what that sort of Labour Brexit would actually look like, we're still unfortunately none the wiser.
What do you think, Owen? What would a Labour Brexit look like? What's your interpretation of what we heard today?
To be honest, I just think the Labour Brexit position ran out of road. I mean, obviously we know now in practice that Labour, as things stand now, back a referendum in terms of any Tory deal, or obviously no deal, which is looming under a Boris Johnson Conservative government, that they would back a referendum and campaign for Remain in that referendum. Now, they haven't clarified the second part of that, which is what would happen if they formed a government. I personally think it's just fantasy stuff now to suggest that in practice, in a Labour manifesto, because what happens, there'll be Labour conference at the end of September. If there's a snap election, there will be a process called the Clause 5 process, in which the stakeholders of the Labour Party come together to determine the manifesto policies. I just think, frankly, as things stand, it's very unlikely that Labour won't go into that election with the same position they just detailed for before the election. Now, what do I think about that in practice? Well, look, I was one of those who, for the last 3 years, and you know this, I've been on your show making this point ad nauseum, which was, we lost the referendum, that kind of sucked, but that was the way it was. So now, because it was a relatively close result, try and negotiate a pretty close relationship with the EU as best as possible that unifies as many people on both sides of the divide, then pivot back to domestic issues like poverty, like living standards, like the NHS, like public services. Now, the problem with that is that what I thought was an entirely principled and correct position, it ran out of road, and I think the European elections, for me, certainly was the end of the road for that, because what's happened, is no deal now is the mainstream Brexit position. That was never put to the British people during the referendum campaign. Anyone during that referendum campaign who suggested what I think would be a self-inflicted disaster of no deal would have been dragged kicking and screaming by either of the official Leave campaigns. So that, the circumstances have just dramatically changed. But the other point is, and I find this sad, but it's just reality, is the middle ground on Brexit has collapsed. So I would still be happy with a soft Brexit. Unfortunately, I have the company of about 13% of the population. If you are a Leave voter, the majority now back no deal, and if you're a Remain voter, many who felt, well, look, don't like the result, but we've got to make this work as best we can, now feel this is just a total disaster. It's sucked the oxygen out of everything, and therefore they just think there has to be another referendum. So I just think in that circumstance, which I think is sad, but nonetheless objective reality, that there just isn't the mood for the kind of position that Labour are pushing.
Okay.
And because no deal now beckons, Labour have no choice, given where their membership and where their voters are at, and given, frankly, where the compromise position in the electorate has collapsed, but to back another referendum with Remain. And that there are lots of downsides. There are no good options here. There's no good options for the country. There's no good options for Labour.
Okay,
within the
I'll come back in a second on that. Perhaps you can discuss that in a bit more detail for me, because I just want Dan to come back on some of the points that you've been making. Dan.
Well, I think where I agree with Owen is that Labour's position and Jeremy Corbyn's position of sort of trying to have his cake and eat it on Brexit has indeed run out of road. But the problem is, even though he's run out of road, Jeremy Corbyn still continues to carry on driving forward with his foot on the accelerator. Owen was saying there that he thinks in terms of if there was a snap election, Labour's position would mirror what its position is today. But the reality is, as I say, we still don't know what Labour's position is. We know whatever the Tories' position is they will oppose, but we don't know what Labour's position is. And the fundamental problem that Labour still has is every time Jeremy Corbyn makes a statement on Brexit, his opening statement remains, we have to respect the referendum result. Now, if Labour is going to continue to say that, then by definition it has to advocate and come forward with its own form of Brexit. Equally, if Jeremy Corbyn tries to ditch that commitment, because remember that's what Labour MPs stood on in 2017, if he attempts to ditch that and say we are now a Remain party in all circumstances, then there are dozens and dozens of Labour MPs who, frankly, I can't see how they could stand on a Labour manifesto which said that, because there are dozens of Labour MPs who have already given commitments to their electorate that they would respect the result, and for them to turn round on the eve of an election, and an election in which the Conservatives will have sort of clarity, I suspect, in terms of what Boris Johnson, presumably what Boris Johnson would be putting forward. Politically, I don't see how that's a viable option for as I say, dozens and dozens and dozens of Labour MPs.
Owen?
Well, firstly, it's somewhat ironic that for so long, Jeremy Corbyn and those around him were often accused of being dogmatists, inflexible, averse to compromise, when actually on Brexit they have genuinely tried to compromise and frankly taken a huge political blow, a massive political cost for doing so. Their membership obviously overwhelmingly did not want Brexit. Most of their voters didn't either. And they suffered the political consequences of that, particularly this year, of course. But in terms of the referendum result, well, that's the point, isn't it, about the circumstances changing, because no deal now is the mainstream Brexit option, and no deal was not offered in the referendum of 2016. In fact, the British people were told repeatedly that getting a deal would be the easiest thing in the world. Given that circumstances changed, given now the Conservative Party has evolved into a no-deal Brexit party, which again was not put to the British people, in that circumstance, then, the circumstances have shifted quite dramatically, to say the least. And that's why another referendum, which people like me feared, and I still have huge problems and reservations about. I didn't enjoy the first referendum and the consequences of it. And as I said, I don't think there are any good options. In terms of Leave MPs, you're quite right. There is, for example, in the shadow cabinet, Ian Lavery, who's the chair of the Labour Party, John Trickett, are those who strongly believe in sticking to the existing policy. They represent heavily Leave seats. But then again, there are others. Diane Abbott, of course, represents a heavily pro-Remain Labour heartland in Hackney. But equally, actually, John McDonnell who represents a Leave voting Greater London seat, as well as Andy McDonald, the Shadow Transport Secretary, who represents, again, a Leave seat. Their view is actually Labour have to shift to this position. And bear in mind, and this is where things get quite complicated, in a lot of those Leave seats, most of Labour's voters voted for Remain. So Labour can't actually win in Leave seats either if those Remain voting voters have defected elsewhere. Now, it's not an easy position that Labour are in, but I think what Labour have to now say is, look, we gave this a go. We tried very hard. We tried to make this work. The Tories messed up the negotiations. The British people are now being offered something which was not on the ballot paper and not offered in the referendum of 2016. Therefore, we're going to go back to the British people. And what they should need to say to Leave voters who are sympathetic to Labour, who all the research shows are least likely to support priority on Brexit, is, look, whatever you think about the position on Brexit, what about a genuine living wage? What about investment in the NHS and public services and taxing the rich? What about rising poverty? What about declining living standards? A radical transformative economic and social agenda. I just think Labour were caught in a trap here and didn't have a choice in the matter.
Sadly, we are out of time, but this breaking news means that you'll probably be back talking to us again tomorrow. Thanks indeed for now. Lord Treesman, former General Secretary of the Labour Party and Chair of the Football Association, has quit the Labour Party with immediate effect, citing institutional anti-Semitism. We know that the Labour Party, the Labour elite, will be speaking about that and discussing their next move as far as anti-Semitism or claims of alleged anti-Semitism are concerned over the coming days. But Lord Treesman is not prepared to wait any longer.